Her hand trembles as she touches the necklace. Her breath catches. That pendant, she knows it. Her eyes fill with tears as she looks up and whispers, Where did you get that necklace?" In that moment, the room falls silent, and a long-buried truth begins to surface. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glittered with Manhattan's elite, a sea of tailored suits and designer gowns mingling beneath crystal chandeliers. Margaret Lancaster stood among a circle of fellow philanthropists, nodding politely as they discussed quarterly projections and tax-deductible donations. At 72, she commanded respect without effort, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her posture that of someone who had never questioned her place at the top of any room she entered. Then everything stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-thought. Her gaze snagged on something across the room, and the polished mask she'd worn for decades cracked in an instant. A young woman in a simple black uniform moved between tables, refilling champagne flutes with the practiced invisibility of someone accustomed to being overlooked. But Margaret saw her. More precisely, Margaret saw what hung at her throat, a delicate silver necklace, unremarkable in its simplicity, yet impossibly devastatingly familiar. Margaret's hand rose to her own chest, as if searching for something that had been missing for years. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion ashen beneath expertly applied makeup. Her fingers trembled visibly, and the champagne flute she'd been holding slipped slightly in her grip before she set it down with unusual clumsiness. The conversations around her continued, but she heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to a single point, that necklace, catching the light as the young woman moved, each glint a ghost from a past Margaret had tried desperately to bury. "Where did you get that necklace?" The words escaped her lips before she could stop them, cutting through the ambient chatter with an urgency that made nearby heads turn. Margaret Lancaster had built an empire from inherited wealth, transforming her family's modest real estate holdings into a billion-dollar conglomerate that stretched across 3 continents. She sat on boards, commanded conference rooms, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives with the stroke of a pen. People didn't argue with Margaret Lancaster. They listened, they complied, and they respected the ice-cold precision with which she conducted every aspect of her life. Her reputation preceded her into every room, untouchable, unshakable, a woman who had survived personal tragedy and professional warfare without ever letting the world see her bleed. The young woman who now stood frozen before her existed in an entirely different universe. Jasmine Torres was 28 and looked older, the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of survival rather than mere tiredness. She worked 3 part-time catering jobs to keep her small apartment and provide for herself, moving through the margins of wealth without ever touching it. Her uniform was borrowed, her shoes scuffed beneath the tablecloths, and the silver necklace at her throat was literally the only possession she owned that predated her memory. It had been with her since she could remember, a mystery she'd stopped trying to solve because answers required resources she'd never had. The contrast between them was almost cinematic in its cruelty, power and vulnerability facing each other across an impossible divide. Margaret, who could buy anything, stared at the one thing money had never been able to recover. Jasmine, who owned nothing, wore the key to a mystery she didn't even know existed. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations faltered as guests registered something wrong in Margaret Lancaster's demeanor. This woman, legendary for her composure, stood trembling in the center of the ballroom, tears welling in eyes that had remained dry through hostile takeovers and public scandals. Whispers rippled outward like concentric circles in disturbed water, speculation building with each past glance and raised eyebrow. Robert Chen, the event manager, materialized at Margaret's elbow with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to handle crises before they became spectacles. He'd organized dozens of Lancaster Foundation events and knew that anything disrupting this woman's carefully maintained facade meant serious trouble. He touched her arm gently, speaking in low, soothing tones meant to de-escalate whatever was happening. But Margaret barely registered his presence. Her focus remained locked on Jasmine, who stood clutching an empty champagne bottle, confusion and growing fear playing across her features. Then Margaret did something no one in that room had ever witnessed. She broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, smearing the makeup that had concealed years of private grief. Her shoulders shook with suppressed emotion, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decades. She demanded a private conversation, not with the authority of a CEO, but with the desperation of someone confronting a ghost. The room fell silent, hundreds of eyes watching as one of New York's most powerful women came undone before them, all because of a necklace that probably cost less than the cheapest appetizer being served. Robert guided them to a service hallway behind the kitchen, away from the prying eyes and camera phones that had already begun capturing Margaret's breakdown. The contrast between the opulent ballroom and this sterile corridor was jarring, fluorescent lights replacing chandeliers, concrete walls instead of silk drapery. Jasmine pressed herself against the far wall, her confusion giving way to genuine alarm. She'd been working events long enough to know that powerful people didn't chase down catering staff unless something had gone terribly wrong, and she frantically reviewed the evening in her mind, searching for whatever mistake had triggered this confrontation. Margaret struggled to compose herself, dabbing at her eyes with trembling fingers before reaching into her clutch. She withdrew a photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling, and held it out with a hand that shook so badly Jasmine had to steady it to see clearly. The image showed a young woman, perhaps 25, with Margaret's same sharp cheekbones and commanding presence. But this woman's expression was softer, her hand resting on a visibly pregnant belly, and around her neck hung an exact replica of the necklace Jasmine now wore. "I gave that necklace to my daughter 30 years ago," Margaret said, her voice cracking on the word daughter. Her name was Caroline Lancaster. She wore it every single day of her pregnancy. She was wearing it the day she died. The words came out in fragments, each one clearly painful, as though speaking them aloud made the loss fresh again. That necklace was supposed to be buried with her. It was supposed to go into the ground with my only child. So I need you to tell me right now how it ended up around your neck. Margaret's composure crumbled further as she spoke of Caroline. The memories clearly still raw despite 3 decades of attempted healing. Her daughter had been brilliant, compassionate, everything a mother could hope for, but also headstrong and independent to a fault. When Caroline got pregnant at 24, she'd refused to reveal the father's identity, insisting she would raise the child alone, despite Margaret's offers of support and resources. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start, complications mounting with each passing month, but Caroline had maintained her stubborn optimism right up until the moment she went into labor. The birth had been a nightmare that Margaret recounted in a hollow voice, staring at something only she could see. Hemorrhaging, emergency procedures, desperate attempts to save both mother and child as everything spiraled out of control. Caroline had died on the operating table, but the baby had survived, extracted via emergency cesarean in those final chaotic moments. Margaret had been in the waiting room when a doctor emerged to deliver the devastating news. Her daughter was gone, but her grandchild had made it. One life traded for another, a bargain Margaret had never wanted to make. What happened next had defined the remainder of Margaret's life. She'd been told the baby, a girl, would be placed for adoption through a private agency. In her grief-stricken state, Margaret had agreed, unable to imagine raising a child that would serve as a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. But weeks later, when the fog of mourning had lifted enough for regret to set in, she'd tried to find her granddaughter. The agency had no records. The hospital claimed procedural confusion. Every investigator she'd hired had hit the same dead end, and eventually the trail had gone completely cold. Jasmine's hand moved unconsciously to the necklace at her throat, her fingers closing around the familiar silver, as Margaret's story settled over her like a shroud. She'd never known her own origin story in such clear terms, had spent her childhood inventing elaborate fantasies about parents who'd loved her but died tragically, or were searching desperately but couldn't find her. The truth, as she'd learned it in fragments through social workers and foster care files, had been far less romantic and far more disturbing. She'd been found in a hospital bathroom at Newark Medical Center, abandoned in the early hours of a winter morning. A cleaning staff member had discovered her, still attached to an umbilical cord that had been crudely cut, wrapped in bloody towels, and tucked behind a toilet in a rarely used restroom on the maternity ward. No mother had come forward. No one had reported a missing newborn. Security footage from that night had mysteriously malfunctioned, and despite a brief investigation, no answers had ever emerged. She'd been labeled Baby Jane Doe and placed into the foster care system, where she'd remained for 18 years, moving between homes, never quite finding a family willing to make her permanent. The necklace had been her only possession when she was found, clutched in her tiny fist, as though someone had deliberately placed it there. Social services had kept it for her, and when she'd aged out of the system at 18, they'd returned it along with the sparse documentation of her origins. She'd worn it every day since, a tangible connection to a past she'd never been able to reconstruct. Now, as Margaret mentioned Newark Medical Center and a baby born 30 years ago, Jasmine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The dates matched perfectly. The location was exact. The impossible was becoming undeniable. Margaret's face transformed as Jasmine finished speaking, grief giving way to something harder and more focused. The business mind that had built an empire kicked into gear, connecting dots with devastating clarity. Her granddaughter hadn't been adopted through proper channels. The baby hadn't been lost to bureaucratic confusion or well-meaning, but misguided social workers. Someone had deliberately taken her daughter's child from the hospital and abandoned her in a bathroom, erasing every trace of the transaction, destroying any connection between the newborn and the Lancaster family. The motive crystallized with sickening obviousness. Caroline's baby had been the sole heir to a fortune most people couldn't comprehend, a child who would have inherited not just money, but control of companies, real estate holdings, investment portfolios that spanned the globe. With Caroline dead and the baby disappeared, the inheritance had defaulted to distant relatives and business partners, people who'd profited enormously from the tragic absence of a direct heir. What Margaret had interpreted as a bureaucratic nightmare, a tragic failure of a system overwhelmed and underfunded, was actually something far more sinister, a calculated crime designed to steal not just a child, but a destiny. Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her tears drying as rage replaced sorrow. Someone had looked at her dying daughter, at a newborn baby fighting for her first breaths, and seen only an obstacle to wealth. Someone had callously ripped that child from the hospital, disposed of her like trash, and then covered their tracks so thoroughly that decades of investigation had yielded nothing. The abandonment, which had seemed cruel enough on its own, was actually the lesser crime. The real crime was abduction, conspiracy, and the theft of an entire life, and whoever had orchestrated it had been living freely for 30 years. What neither woman realized was that their entire conversation had an audience. Robert Chen stood just around the corner, ostensibly checking on arrangements for dessert service, but in reality frozen in place by what he was hearing. His face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Every word they spoke was another nail in a coffin he'd thought sealed decades ago, a past he'd believed successfully buried beneath years of carefully constructed normalcy. Robert had been someone else 30 years ago. Bobby Chen, a night shift nurse at Newark Medical Center, drowning in gambling debts that threatened not just his career, but his life. The men he owed didn't accept payment plans or show mercy for sob stories, and when they'd approached him with an offer, he'd been desperate enough to listen. Make a baby disappear, they'd said. A baby whose existence was inconvenient to some very wealthy, very motivated people. They'd offered him enough money to clear his debts and start over, and in his panic and desperation he'd agreed. He'd told himself it was almost victimless. The mother was already dead, the grandmother too grief-stricken to think clearly, and babies got adopted all the time. He'd simply be facilitating a different kind of adoption, one without paperwork or oversight. He'd been the one to cut the security camera feeds. He'd been the one to take the baby from the nursery during a shift change when nobody was watching closely enough. He'd been the one to place her in that bathroom with the necklace still clutched in her hand, unable to quite bring himself to remove that final connection to her origin. And then he'd walked away, collected his payment, paid off his debts, and spent 30 years building a new life, never imagining the past would surface in such a spectacularly impossible way. Margaret made the call before they even left the hallway, her phone producing a private medical team within hours. She'd learned long ago that wealth could accelerate almost any process, and DNA testing was no exception when you knew which labs to contact and what premiums to pay for immediate results. Jasmine submitted to the cheek swab in a daze, still processing the possibility that her entire understanding of her identity might be wrong, that the desperate origin story she'd been told might actually be a cover for something more complex and more connected to power than she'd ever imagined. The waiting period was surreal. Margaret installed Jasmine in a hotel suite, not the plaza where the event had occurred, but a quieter property she owned outright, where privacy could be absolutely guaranteed. They sat in careful silence, both afraid to hope, both terrified of what confirmation would mean. Margaret ordered food that went largely uneaten. Jasmine stared at the photograph of Caroline, searching for resemblances in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, trying to see herself in this woman she'd never known existed until hours ago. When the call came, Margaret answered on the first ring. The geneticist's voice was calm and professional, but the information was anything but routine. The DNA match was conclusive and irrefutable. Jasmine Torres shared genetic markers that confirmed a direct biological relationship to Margaret Lancaster. She was, without any scientific doubt, the granddaughter who had been lost 3 decades ago. The abandoned baby in the bathroom had been a stolen heiress. The foster child who'd never been chosen had actually been the most sought-after missing person in a search that had consumed years and resources. Everything Jasmine had believed about herself, every conclusion she'd drawn from her circumstances, had been built on a foundation of lies. And now, in a single phone call, her entire reality had been rewritten. The story broke before Margaret could control it, leaked by someone at the testing facility, or perhaps overheard by hotel staff. Within 24 hours, every major news outlet was running variations of the same headline: "Billionaire's missing grandchild found alive after 30 years. The narrative practically wrote itself, a fairy tale for the modern age, rags to riches with a mystery at its heart. Camera crews materialized outside Margaret's corporate headquarters. Reporters tracked down Jasmine's former foster families. Speculation ran wild about inheritance, about reconciliation, about whether this was somehow an elaborate con despite the DNA evidence. Margaret's response surprised everyone who knew her. The woman who had built her reputation on strategic media manipulation, who understood the value of controlling public narrative, refused every interview request. She declined to appear on morning shows, turned down exclusive sit-downs with major journalists, and issued only a terse statement through her lawyers confirming the basic facts and requesting privacy. This wasn't about publicity or corporate image. This wasn't an opportunity to be leveraged for positive press or philanthropic positioning. This was personal in a way that transcended her usual calculations. Instead, Margaret directed her considerable resources toward a different goal: justice. She hired forensic accountants to trace financial records from 3 decades ago. She brought in private investigators with backgrounds in cold cases. She filed motions to unseal hospital records and subpoena personnel files. The focus wasn't on celebrating the reunion or capitalizing on the miraculous discovery. The focus was on finding whoever had orchestrated the abduction and ensuring they faced consequences for a crime they'd believed themselves free from forever. Margaret had lost 30 years with her granddaughter. Someone was going to answer for that, regardless of how long it took or what it cost to achieve. The investigation unfolded with the methodical precision of a military campaign, Margaret deploying resources with a focus she hadn't felt in years. Her corporate conference room transformed into a war room, whiteboards covering every available wall, timelines stretching across decades, connections mapped with colored string like something from a detective thriller. She assembled a team that read like a roster of the country's most formidable investigators: former FBI agents specializing in financial crimes, forensic accountants who'd unraveled corporate frauds worth billions, retired detectives who'd built careers on solving cold cases everyone else had abandoned, and lawyers whose reputations for tenacity bordered on legendary. The hospital records came first, extracted through a combination of legal pressure and the kind of influence that only serious wealth could exert. Newark Medical Center had long since updated its systems, but paper archives from 3 decades ago still existed in a climate-controlled basement, yellowing files that hadn't been touched in years. What they revealed was immediately suspicious. Entire shifts' worth of documentation were missing from the night of Caroline's death and the baby's disappearance. Nursing logs that should have recorded every movement in and out of the maternity ward simply didn't exist. Security footage that should have been archived as a matter of standard procedure had been recorded over. The tapes reused in a violation of hospital policy that no one had apparently questioned at the time. But absence of evidence told its own story, and Margaret's team knew how to read between the lines. They cross-referenced personnel schedules with the missing documentation, identifying everyone who'd been working that night. Most were retired or had moved on to other facilities, but their names became starting points for deeper investigation. Phone records from that era, painstakingly reconstructed from telecommunications company archives, showed unusual patterns of calls in the days immediately before and after the incident. Bank records, obtained through subpoenas that Margaret's lawyers pushed through with remarkable speed, revealed deposits and withdrawals that didn't match the modest salaries of hospital staff. The forensic accountants proved particularly valuable, their expertise transforming scattered financial breadcrumbs into a coherent trail. They discovered a series of shell companies, layered and nested within each other like Russian dolls, designed to obscure the flow of money. Payments had originated from a parent corporation, filtered through multiple intermediary accounts in different states, before landing in personal bank accounts belonging to individuals connected to Newark Medical Center. The amounts weren't enormous by Margaret's standards, but for working-class hospital employees in the early 90s, 50,000 here, 75,000 there, these were life-changing sums that would have been impossible to refuse for someone sufficiently desperate or morally flexible. One name appeared repeatedly in the financial documents, signing off on transfers and authorizing payments with a frequency that suggested direct involvement rather than administrative coincidence. The accountants flagged it, highlighted it, presented it to Margaret with the gravity of people who understood they'd found something significant. The investigation began to focus, narrowing from dozens of potential suspects to a core group of individuals who'd been present, motivated, and compensated. Evidence emerged in fragments, encrypted emails recovered from ancient servers, testimony from former colleagues who remembered suspicious behavior, paper trails that connected hospital staff to lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. Robert Chen's name surfaced early in the investigation, his position as night nurse during the relevant time frame placing him at the center of opportunity. His sudden career change shortly after the incident, transitioning from healthcare to event management, raised immediate red flags. His financial history from that period revealed the smoking gun. Massive gambling debts paid off in a single transaction just weeks after the baby's disappearance, the money coming from one of the shell companies Margaret's team had identified. But Robert was clearly a tool, someone who'd executed the crime rather than conceived it. The investigators pushed deeper, following the money upstream to its source, determined to identify not just the hands that had stolen the baby, but the mind that had ordered the theft. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired hospital administrator with a guilty conscience and a terminal diagnosis that made her willing to talk. She'd been pressured to destroy records, threatened with professional ruin if she asked questions about irregularities in the maternity ward. She provided names, dates, and details that corroborated everything the investigation had uncovered independently. More importantly, she revealed the existence of a confidential legal agreement drafted by a corporate law firm and signed by multiple parties that essentially paid for silence regarding irregularities in patient care and infant placement procedures. The agreement was carefully worded to sound like a standard settlement of potential malpractice claims, but its true purpose was transparent to anyone reading closely. It was hush money, distributed to ensure cooperation in a conspiracy. Margaret stood before the evidence wall late one night, alone in the conference room after her team had departed, and felt the full weight of what they'd uncovered. This hadn't been a spontaneous crime of opportunity. This had been planned, coordinated, and executed with chilling efficiency by people who understood exactly what they were doing and what they were destroying. Her granddaughter's entire childhood had been stolen not through carelessness or tragic circumstance, but through deliberate, calculated malice. Someone had looked at a grieving mother and a newborn baby and seen only obstacles to be removed, and that someone had very nearly gotten away with it completely. The final piece of the puzzle emerged from documents that had been sealed by court order decades ago, their contents protected by confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure clauses that Margaret's lawyers had to fight through multiple judicial levels to access. What they revealed was both shocking and, in retrospect, devastatingly obvious. The shell companies, when traced to their ultimate origin, all connected back to a single source. Victoria Ashford, Margaret's former business partner and one-time closest friend, a woman who'd been dead for 15 years, but whose malice apparently extended beyond the grave. Victoria and Margaret had built their first company together in their 30s, two ambitious women, in an era when female entrepreneurs were still rarities in the corporate world. They'd been formidable as a team, Margaret providing the strategic vision and Victoria supplying the operational ruthlessness necessary to survive in cutthroat industries. But as their success grew, so did the tensions between them. Victoria had always been the more aggressive partner, pushing for expansions and acquisitions that Margaret considered too risky, advocating for business practices that crossed ethical lines Margaret wasn't willing to breach. The partnership had fractured slowly, disagreements accumulating until finally, 5 years before Caroline's death, they'd dissolved their business relationship in a split that had been professionally cordial but personally devastating. The investigation revealed what Margaret had never suspected. Victoria had never accepted the dissolution. Corporate records showed her attempting to maintain control through proxies and shell investments, fighting to preserve influence even as Margaret bought her out and took sole control of their enterprises. Victoria had viewed the split as a betrayal, a theft of something that rightfully belonged to her as much as to Margaret. And when Caroline became pregnant, when it became clear that a new generation of Lancasters would inherit and control everything Victoria had helped build, her resentment had apparently curdled into something darker and more dangerous. The motive, once understood, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Victoria couldn't destroy Margaret's business empire directly, not after the dissolution had been legally finalized and her own stake had been converted to cash. But she could destroy Margaret emotionally, could take from her the one thing money couldn't replace: family. The plan had required patience and preparation, establishing the shell companies years in advance, cultivating relationships with corruptible hospital staff, positioning all the pieces so that when opportunity arose, everything could be executed swiftly and irreversibly. When Caroline died in childbirth, Victoria had seen her moment and seized it without hesitation. But Victoria's plan had an additional dimension that Margaret's investigators uncovered in the final layers of documentation. It wasn't just about causing emotional devastation, though that was certainly part of the satisfaction Victoria had apparently anticipated. It was also brutally practical. With Caroline dead and the baby disappeared, presumed adopted or lost to bureaucracy, the inheritance structure of Margaret's empire became vulnerable in ways it otherwise wouldn't have been. Distant relatives suddenly had claims. Business partners gained leverage in negotiations. Victoria herself, through carefully maintained minority investments and strategic relationships, stood to benefit enormously from the chaos and uncertainty that followed the baby's disappearance. Victoria had died 15 years ago from cancer, taking whatever satisfaction she'd derived from her crime to the grave, without ever facing consequences or exposure. But the conspiracy she'd orchestrated had required accomplices, people who'd executed her vision and maintained the cover-up for 3 decades. The lawyer who'd drafted the confidentiality agreements was still practicing, now a senior partner at a prestigious firm. The accountant who'd managed the shell company payments had retired wealthy, his lifestyle inconsistent with what his legitimate career should have provided. Hospital administrators who'd destroyed records and intimidated potential witnesses had moved on to other institutions, their complicity undetected and unpunished. Robert Chen had built an entire second career, working events for the same family he'd helped victimize, the audacity of it almost breathtaking in its brazenness. Margaret's grief, which had evolved into rage during the investigation, now crystallized into something colder and more focused: determination. Victoria might be beyond justice, but her accomplices weren't. Every person who'd participated in stealing 30 years from Margaret and Jasmine, who'd profited from a crime they'd believed successfully buried, was going to face consequences. Margaret had the evidence, she had the resources, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. The hunt for truth was complete. Now came the reckoning. The arrests happened simultaneously, coordinated with law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions to prevent any possibility of suspects fleeing or destroying evidence. Robert Chen was taken into custody at his home early on a Tuesday morning, still in his pajamas when federal agents knocked on his door with a warrant. The shock on his face was absolute. 30 years of false security evaporating in the moment he saw Margaret Lancaster standing behind the agents, her expression carved from ice. He'd worked her events for a decade, had stood in her presence dozens of times, and never once had she recognized him as the young nurse who'd stolen her granddaughter. But she recognized him now, and the weight of that recognition crushed whatever denial he might have attempted. The lawyer Douglas Pritchard was arrested at his office during a meeting with clients. The humiliation of being led out in handcuffs through a lobby full of associates and partners almost as devastating as the charges themselves. His career, built on reputation and discretion, was destroyed the moment news cameras captured him being loaded into a police vehicle. The firm immediately distanced itself, releasing statements about their shock and commitment to cooperation, but the stain on their legacy was permanent. Pritchard had helped draft the confidentiality agreements, had structured the shell companies, had provided the legal framework that made Victoria's conspiracy possible. His guilt was documented in his own meticulous files, correspondence that he'd apparently kept as insurance, but which now became evidence of his complicity. The accountant Gerald Hofstetter tried to run. He'd apparently monitored news coverage of the investigation with growing alarm, and when he'd seen the net tightening, he'd attempted to flee to a country without extradition treaties. He made it as far as the airport before being apprehended, his hastily packed bags containing cash, forged documents and, remarkably, copies of the same financial records Margaret's team had already obtained through legal channels. His flight was an admission of guilt more damning than any testimony, and when prosecutors offered him a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation and detailed testimony about the conspiracy, he accepted immediately, providing information that filled in gaps and confirmed suspicions. Hospital administrators faced their own reckonings. The ones who destroyed records or looked the other way while irregularities occurred had mostly retired, but age wasn't a shield against justice. Margaret's lawyers pursued charges with relentless focus, and district attorneys, energized by the high-profile nature of the case and the clarity of the evidence, brought indictments with unusual speed. Some of the administrators claimed ignorance, insisting they'd simply followed orders without understanding the fuller context. Others maintained a stubborn silence, perhaps hoping that the passage of time and the deaths of key conspirators like Victoria would somehow protect them. None of these strategies proved effective against the sheer volume of documentation Margaret's team had assembled. The trials, when they came, were extensively covered but relatively brief. The evidence was overwhelming, presented by prosecutors who'd been given everything they needed to secure convictions. Robert Chen pleaded guilty to kidnapping, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, his testimony providing crucial details about how the actual abduction had been executed. He described taking the baby from the nursery during a shift change, placing her in the bathroom with the necklace still in her hand because some vestige of conscience wouldn't allow him to remove that final connection, then walking away and collecting payment that had seemed like salvation at the time, but which he now recognized as the price of his soul. Douglas Pritchard fought the charges initially, his legal expertise apparently convincing him that he could find procedural errors or technicalities to exploit. But as the trial progressed, and witness after witness corroborated the prosecution's narrative, his defense crumbled. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. His sentencing was particularly harsh, the judge noting that as an officer of the court, he'd betrayed not just his clients, but the entire legal system that had granted him the privilege of practicing law. Gerald Hofstetter's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence, but he still faced years in federal prison, his testimony having provided the detailed financial roadmap that connected every conspirator to specific payments and actions. He'd kept meticulous records of every transaction, apparently believing they'd protect him if the conspiracy ever turned against him, never imagining they'd instead become the evidence that confirmed his guilt beyond any doubt. The hospital administrators received varying sentences based on their levels of involvement, from probation for those who'd merely failed to ask questions to significant prison time for those who'd actively participated in destroying evidence or intimidating potential witnesses. Several lost professional licenses, medical and administrative credentials revoked by oversight boards that couldn't ignore such clear violations of ethical obligations. Margaret attended every hearing, every trial, every sentencing. She sat in the gallery with Jasmine beside her, both women needing to witness this final chapter, to see justice administered even though it couldn't restore what had been stolen. When the last sentence was handed down, when the final conspirator had been led away to begin serving their time, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of completion. The truth had been exposed. The guilty had been punished. It didn't undo 30 years of loss, didn't give Jasmine back her childhood or Margaret back the time she should have had with her granddaughter, but it meant the crime hadn't been committed with impunity. It meant Victoria Ashford's malice hadn't achieved its ultimate goal of permanent separation and unaccountable destruction. The euphoria of justice, such as it was, faded quickly in the days following the final sentencing. Margaret and Jasmine found themselves in the strange position of having achieved everything they'd fought for legally, while remaining profoundly aware that the victory was hollow in fundamental ways. Convictions couldn't restore Jasmine's childhood. Prison sentences for conspirators couldn't give Margaret back the decades she should have spent watching her granddaughter grow. The truth, now exposed and documented, illuminated exactly how much had been lost, and the clarity was painful rather than healing. Jasmine struggled with the aftermath in ways that surprised her. She'd imagined that confirmation of her identity, connection to family, and justice for the crimes committed against her would feel like triumph, like the conclusion of a heroic journey where the protagonist finally receives what they'd been denied. Instead, she felt unmoored, grieving for experiences she'd never had and couldn't reclaim. She'd spent 28 years building an identity around being unwanted, around surviving without family or support, around the belief that she was fundamentally alone in the world. That identity, though painful, had been hers, had shaped every decision and relationship she'd formed. Now she was supposed to be someone else entirely, a Lancaster heir, a granddaughter of privilege, someone who should have grown up in wealth and security rather than foster homes and poverty. The trauma of her childhood couldn't be erased by acknowledgement or compensated by belated justice. She'd been moved between 17 different foster placements, some loving but temporary, others neglectful or actively harmful. She'd learned not to attach, not to hope for permanence, not to imagine futures that extended beyond immediate survival. She'd aged out of the system at 18 with minimal support, had struggled through community college while working multiple jobs, had built a life on the assumption that no one was coming to rescue her, because no one even knew she needed rescuing. Those experiences had left marks that money and family connection couldn't simply smooth away. Margaret, for her part, had to confront the reality that she'd lived 30 years while her granddaughter had suffered, had built companies and accumulated wealth, while Jasmine had moved between foster homes, wearing second-hand clothes and wondering why she'd been abandoned. The guilt was crushing despite the intellectual understanding that she'd been a victim of the conspiracy too, that she'd hired investigators and searched desperately before finally accepting what she'd been told about adoption and closed records. She'd given up eventually, had allowed herself to believe her granddaughter was living a good life somewhere with adoptive parents who loved her, had constructed a narrative that made the loss bearable. Learning the truth meant confronting how wrong that narrative had been, how her granddaughter had needed her desperately while she'd been convincing herself that everything had worked out for the best. They had conversations that were halting and painful, both women trying to bridge a gap that 3 decades had carved between them. Jasmine wanted to be angry, but found herself mostly sad, mourning a relationship that should have existed, but never had the chance to develop. Margaret wanted to fix everything immediately, but was learning that some damages couldn't be repaired through action or resources, that sometimes the only response to profound loss was acknowledgement and grief. They cried together, not tears of joy at reunion, but tears of shared mourning for everything the conspiracy had stolen from both of them. Therapy became essential, both individual and joint sessions, where they could process trauma and loss with professional guidance. Jasmine's therapist helped her understand that acknowledging her pain didn't mean rejecting the connection to Margaret, that she could simultaneously grieve her stolen childhood and embrace the family relationship that was now possible. Margaret's therapist worked with her on accepting what couldn't be changed, on channeling her impulse to fix and control into support for Jasmine's healing process, rather than attempts to somehow compensate for lost time through grand gestures or overwhelming generosity. Slowly, painfully, they began to transform their grief into something more constructive. They couldn't change the past, couldn't restore what Victoria's conspiracy had destroyed, but they could ensure that their experience meant something, that the exposure of this crime led to changes that would protect other vulnerable children. Justice for themselves was complete, but justice as a broader principle required more than punishment for conspirators. It required systemic changes that would make such crimes harder to commit and easier to detect. Margaret's first instinct had been to simply transfer wealth, to write checks that would immediately elevate Jasmine's material circumstances to match her birthright. But Jasmine had pushed back, uncomfortable with the idea of sudden, unearned affluence, wanting to maintain some sense of agency and self-determination, even as her life transformed. They'd negotiated, sometimes tensely, finding a middle ground between Margaret's desire to provide everything her granddaughter had been denied and Jasmine's need to preserve her identity as someone who'd survived through her own resilience rather than passive dependence. Education became the first priority, not as charity but as reclamation of opportunities that should have been available all along. Jasmine had completed some community college courses years ago, but had abandoned her education when financial pressures made it impossible to balance school with the multiple jobs necessary for survival. Now she enrolled in a university program, choosing her own course of study, pursuing interests she'd suppressed as impractical when survival had been her primary concern. Margaret funded it completely but framed it as family investment rather than philanthropy, making clear that this was simply what grandparents did for their grandchildren. What should have happened 18 years ago when Jasmine had aged out of foster care with minimal support and no safety net. Financial stability came gradually, structured through trusts and guided investments rather than sudden lump sum transfers. Margaret's financial advisors worked with Jasmine to build understanding of wealth management, teaching her the mechanics of investment and asset allocation, treating her as an adult, learning to manage resources rather than a child receiving an allowance. Jasmine received access to income immediately, enough to live comfortably without the constant financial anxiety that had defined her entire adult life. But the bulk of her inheritance was structured to provide long-term security while preventing the kind of wasteful spending that sometimes destroyed people who received sudden wealth without preparation. More important than the money, though, was the reclamation of identity. Jasmine had lived her entire life as Jasmine Torres, the name assigned by social services when she'd been found abandoned. Now she faced the question of whether to reclaim her birth name, to legally become a Lancaster, to formally acknowledge the connection that DNA had confirmed. The decision was complicated, layered with emotional significance. Jasmine Torres was who she'd been for 28 years, the identity through which she'd survived and built resilience. But she was also Caroline Lancaster's daughter, Margaret's granddaughter, heir to a legacy she'd never known existed. She chose both eventually, maintaining Torres as part of her legal name while adding Lancaster, creating a hyphenated identity that acknowledged both who she'd been and who she was discovering herself to be. The decision felt right, a way of honoring her survival while embracing connection to family. Margaret supported it without reservation, understanding that her granddaughter needed to define herself rather than simply accepting a predetermined identity. The relationship between them evolved beyond legal and financial arrangements into something more genuine and complex. They learned each other's rhythms, discovered shared traits and divergent perspectives, built the kind of intimacy that usually developed over decades but which they had to compress and construct deliberately. Margaret shared stories of Caroline, showing Jasmine photos and letters, giving her access to a mother she'd never known. Jasmine shared her experiences of foster care and survival, helping Margaret understand the reality of the life her granddaughter had lived, refusing to soften or romanticize the hardships that had shaped her. They established boundaries and expectations, negotiating the terms of their relationship with unusual explicitness because they couldn't rely on the natural evolution that typical family bonds experienced. Jasmine insisted on maintaining her own apartment rather than moving into Margaret's mansion, needing space and independence even as she embraced connection. Margaret respected this while making clear that resources were available whenever needed, that support didn't require cohabitation or constant proximity. They scheduled regular dinners, established traditions they could build together, created new shared experiences rather than dwelling exclusively on everything they'd missed. What emerged wasn't a replacement for the relationship they should have had, wasn't a recreation of what grandmother and granddaughter bonds typically looked like, but it was real and valuable in its own right. Jasmine's life transformed not through magical rescue or sudden elevation to privilege, but through deliberate, thoughtful reconstruction of circumstances and opportunities. She was no longer the struggling single mother working catering jobs to survive, but neither was she simply a passive recipient of inherited wealth. She was someone finding her place between two identities, building a future that honored both her survival and her birthright. The idea emerged during one of their weekly dinners, a conversation that started as personal reflection and evolved into something larger and more purposeful. Jasmine had been describing her experiences in the foster care system, the systematic failures and occasional moments of genuine care she'd encountered, when Margaret had suddenly gone quiet, her mind clearly working through possibilities. What if their experience, painful as it was, could prevent similar crimes and protect other vulnerable children? What if they transformed their personal tragedy into institutional change? The Caroline Lancaster Foundation was established 6 months after the trials concluded, funded with a substantial portion of Margaret's wealth and structured to address multiple dimensions of child welfare and maternal support. The mission was deliberately comprehensive, attacking the problem from several angles simultaneously rather than focusing narrowly on a single issue. They wanted to prevent crimes like the one committed against Jasmine, but they also wanted to support children and mothers who were vulnerable for dozens of other reasons, to create systems of protection that didn't rely solely on criminal prosecution after damage had already been done. The first pillar focused on hospital system reform, working to establish protocols and oversight mechanisms that would make it significantly harder for newborns to disappear or be stolen. The foundation funded advanced security systems for maternity wards, including biometric identification for infants, electronic monitoring that tracked every movement between rooms, and redundant verification procedures for any transfer of custody. They pushed for legislation requiring specific training for hospital staff on identifying suspicious behavior and reporting concerns about potential child trafficking or abduction. They established audit systems that regularly reviewed hospital records for gaps or irregularities that might indicate crimes or cover-ups. The second pillar addressed the foster care system directly, working to improve conditions and support for children aging out without permanent families. The foundation funded scholarships specifically for former foster children, providing not just tuition but comprehensive support including housing, counseling, and mentorship. They established advocacy programs that gave foster children legal representation independent of the state system, ensuring someone was fighting specifically for each child's best interests. They created transition programs for 18-year-olds aging out of care, providing extended support during those critical first years of independence when many former foster children struggled or failed completely. The third pillar focused on single mothers, recognizing that financial desperation often created vulnerabilities that criminals could exploit. The foundation provided emergency financial assistance to mothers in crisis, helping them avoid situations where they might feel forced to make desperate decisions about their children's welfare. They funded childcare programs that allowed single mothers to maintain employment or pursue education. They established job training and placement services tailored to women managing childcare responsibilities. The goal was to create economic stability that reduced vulnerability, to ensure that being a single mother didn't automatically mean living in constant precarity. Jasmine became the foundation's public face, sharing her story in controlled interviews and public appearances, using her experience to advocate for systemic changes. She spoke at legislative hearings about foster care reform, testified before medical boards about hospital security protocols, and gave keynote addresses at conferences about child welfare. Her story was powerful precisely because it was true, and because she'd survived not through rescue, but through resilience, making her credible in ways that theoretical advocates couldn't match. She was living proof that the system failed children regularly, and that those failures had lifelong consequences worth preventing. Margaret focused on the strategic and financial dimensions, leveraging her business relationships to build partnerships with hospitals, government agencies, and other philanthropic organizations. She pushed for policy changes at state and federal levels, funding lobbying efforts and providing expert testimony about corporate governance structures that could be adapted to child welfare systems. She used her reputation and connections ruthlessly, calling in favors and applying pressure to ensure the Foundation's recommendations were taken seriously, rather than dismissed as idealistic but impractical reforms. The Foundation grew rapidly, becoming a significant force in child welfare advocacy within its first 2 years of operation. They funded research that provided empirical evidence for their proposed reforms. They published reports that exposed ongoing systemic failures and proposed specific, actionable solutions. They worked directly with vulnerable populations, providing immediate support, while simultaneously pushing for institutional changes that would reduce the need for such emergency interventions. What made the Foundation particularly effective was that it combined Margaret's resources and strategic acumen with Jasmine's lived experience and moral authority. They weren't wealthy donors imposing solutions from a distance, nor were they well-meaning advocates without the resources to implement their vision. They were grandmother and granddaughter who'd been victimized by a conspiracy that exploited systemic failures, and they were determined to ensure those same failures didn't victimize others. Caroline's death had been tragic and unavoidable, but the theft of her baby had been entirely preventable. The Foundation existed to ensure prevention became reality, that no other child would be stolen, and no other grandmother would spend decades searching for a granddaughter who'd been deliberately made to disappear. The relationship between Margaret and Jasmine deepened in ways that transcended the dramatic circumstances of their reunion. In the quiet moments between Foundation work and public advocacy, they built something genuinely familial, learning to be family to each other despite having no shared history or childhood memories to draw upon. Margaret's penthouse became a place Jasmine visited regularly, not out of obligation, but because it felt increasingly like coming home, like connecting with something she'd been missing, without fully understanding the nature of the absence. Margaret had preserved everything related to Caroline. Decades of materials stored carefully in climate-controlled archives that she'd been unable to discard but too painful to regularly access. Now she brought them out, sharing her daughter with her granddaughter through photographs, letters, journals, and personal belongings. Jasmine studied images of her mother at different ages, searching for resemblances and trying to construct understanding of someone she'd never meet. Caroline at 5, gap-toothed and grinning. Caroline at 16, rebellious and brilliant. Caroline at 24, pregnant and radiant, despite the complications that would ultimately kill her. The letters were particularly precious, Caroline's voice preserved on paper, her thoughts and dreams and daily frustrations captured in handwriting that Jasmine traced with her fingers, trying to feel connected across the decades. Caroline had written to Margaret regularly even when they lived in the same city, apparently finding written communication easier for certain kinds of emotional expression. She'd written about the pregnancy, her excitement and terror in equal measure, her determination to raise the baby alone, mixed with gratitude for Margaret's support. She'd written about choosing names, about preparing a nursery, about imagining who this child would become. She'd never imagined she wouldn't live to meet her daughter, that these letters would become the closest Jasmine would ever get to knowing her. Margaret shared stories that went beyond documentation, the kinds of memories that never made it into photographs or journals. Caroline's fierce intelligence and equally fierce stubbornness, traits Margaret recognized immediately in Jasmine. Caroline's sense of humor, dry and unexpected, that had diffused countless tense situations. Caroline's compassion for underdogs and outsiders, which had apparently driven her interest in social work and advocacy. Caroline's complicated relationship with wealth, embracing the opportunities it provided while feeling guilty about privileges she recognized as unearned. Jasmine absorbed it all, constructing a portrait of her mother from fragments and second-hand memories. She grieved for Caroline freshly, mourning not just the abstract loss of a mother she'd never known, but the specific loss of this particular woman who shared her traits and might have understood her in ways no one else could. She grieved for Caroline, too, for the daughter who died without meeting the baby she'd carried, without knowing whether her child would survive or what would happen to her. They established rituals together, creating new traditions, since they had no shared history of holidays or celebrations. Weekly dinners where they cooked together, Margaret teaching Jasmine recipes Caroline had loved, while Jasmine introduced her grandmother to foods from her own experiences. Monthly visits to Caroline's grave, where they left flowers and shared updates about the foundation and their lives, talking to someone who couldn't hear but whose presence they both needed to acknowledge. Annual celebrations of Caroline's birthday, marking the day with both grief and gratitude for the daughter and mother who'd connected them across decades. The bond that formed was different from typical grandparent-grandchild relationships, more conscious and deliberate, but no less genuine for being constructed rather than naturally evolved. Margaret found herself softening in ways she hadn't expected, the ice-cold CEO persona that had defined her public identity, giving way to something warmer and more vulnerable in Jasmine's presence. She shared doubts and regrets she'd never voiced to anyone, talking about mistakes she'd made with Caroline, opportunities for connection she'd missed while building her empire, her grief over having prioritized business success over available time with her daughter. Jasmine, in turn, allowed herself to be vulnerable in ways her survival instincts had always prevented. She shared her fears and insecurities, her ongoing struggles with feeling worthy of the life she now had access to, her occasional resentment of Margaret for having lived in comfort while she'd suffered, immediately followed by guilt for feeling resentment towards someone who'd also been victimized. Margaret received it all without defensiveness, understanding that healing required honesty rather than politeness, that real relationship meant accepting complexity and occasional anger rather than maintaining careful courtesy. They discovered shared interests beyond their family connection and foundation work. Both loved classical music, finding peace in symphony performances they attended together. Both were voracious readers, though with different tastes they slowly influenced in each other. Both had unexpected senses of humor that emerged gradually as comfort increased, discovering they could make each other laugh in ways that felt like reclaiming joy that had been stolen from both of them. The relationship wasn't perfect or simple. They had arguments and misunderstandings, moments when the gap in their experiences felt insurmountable, or when Margaret's instinct to control clashed with Jasmine's hard-won independence. But they learned to navigate conflict, to apologize and repair and recommit to building something neither of them had expected to have. Margaret had lost her daughter, but gained her granddaughter, and while one could never replace the other, the connection was precious in its own right. Jasmine had lost a childhood and the mother she should have known, but found family and belonging, and while it came decades too late, it still mattered profoundly. The necklace that had started everything, that simple piece of silver that had stopped Margaret cold in a ballroom and unraveled a 30-year-old crime, became a symbol they both needed to reckon with deliberately. It sat in a safe deposit box now, the original carefully preserved under climate-controlled conditions, too precious and too laden with meaning to be worn casually, but too significant to be forgotten or dismissed. Margaret had it appraised by historians and jewelers not to determine monetary value, but to understand its full story. The necklace was older than either of them had realized, a family heirloom that had belonged to Margaret's own grandmother, passed down through generations of Lancaster women. Caroline had been given it on her 18th birthday, part of a tradition of inheritance that connected women across generations of the family. When Caroline had died, Margaret had intended for it to be buried with her daughter, a final gift to accompany her into death since she couldn't carry it forward in life. Its survival, still clutched in an abandoned baby's fist, had been an act of preservation that neither Margaret nor whoever had stolen Jasmine had fully understood. The symbolism was almost overwhelming once fully recognized. The necklace represented continuity across generations, a physical link between great-grandmother, grandmother, mother, and daughter, despite decades of separation and loss. It had survived when everything else had been stolen or destroyed, had remained with Jasmine through 17 foster placements and constant instability, had been the one possession she'd never sold or lost, despite desperate poverty. It had waited decades to fulfill its purpose, to connect family members who'd been forcibly separated, to serve as the key that unlocked a mystery everyone else had given up trying to solve. Margaret commissioned a replica, worked with a master jeweler to create an exact copy that Jasmine could wear daily without risking damage to the original. The replica was perfect in every detail, indistinguishable from the original to casual observation, but marked on the inside with an inscription that acknowledged its nature. For Jasmine, from Margaret, in memory of Caroline. The original remained in the safe deposit box, visited occasionally, a relic of survival and connection, too important to risk losing, but also too sacred to be treated as mere jewelry. Jasmine wore the replica constantly, feeling its weight at her throat as a reminder of everything she'd survived and everything she'd found. When she gave speeches about foster care reform or testified about hospital security, the necklace glinted under camera lights, a visual reminder of the story that gave her authority to speak. When she sat in university classrooms pursuing the education she'd been denied, it reminded her why she was there, what opportunities had been stolen and were now being reclaimed. When she had dinner with Margaret or visited Caroline's grave, it was a physical connection to family, a tangible symbol of belonging that her entire childhood had lacked. The meaning evolved over time, becoming more complex and layered as their story moved forward. Initially it had been evidence, the object that proved conspiracy and theft. Then it became symbol of survival, proof that Jasmine had carried her identity even when everything else about her origins had been obscured. Later it represented justice, the key piece of evidence that had made accountability possible. Eventually, it transformed into something more abstract and more powerful, a representation of destiny and purpose, the idea that some connections were strong enough to survive decades of deliberate destruction. That truth eventually emerged, regardless of how thoroughly criminals tried to bury it. Jasmine's transformation from silent survivor to public advocate happened gradually, each speaking engagement building her confidence and refining her message. She testified before congressional committees about foster care reform, her voice steady as she described the 17 placements that had defined her childhood, the instability that had taught her never to attach or hope for permanence. Legislators who'd treated child welfare as an abstract policy issue found themselves confronting the human cost of systemic failures, unable to dismiss her testimony as theoretical when she embodied every statistic they'd previously ignored. Her advocacy extended beyond government hearings into media appearances and public forums, where she reached broader audiences. She spoke at conferences about single motherhood, sharing how financial desperation created vulnerabilities that criminals exploited, how the lack of support systems pushed women toward impossible choices. She partnered with other advocacy organizations, lending her story and her family's resources to campaigns for maternal health care, childcare subsidies, and economic protections. Her trauma, which could have remained private grief, instead became fuel for policy changes that would protect others from similar fates. She'd survived her stolen childhood, and now she was ensuring that survival meant something beyond her individual story, that it translated into systemic changes, protecting vulnerable children and struggling mothers across the country. Margaret stood at her office window overlooking Manhattan, the empire she'd built spreading beneath her in steel and glass, and understood finally what truly mattered. Decades of accumulating wealth had brought her power and influence, but those things had meant nothing during the 30 years she'd lived without her granddaughter. She'd commanded boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals while Jasmine had moved between foster homes, and all her resources hadn't prevented that tragedy or detected the crime until chance and a necklace had intervened. She'd learned painfully and irrevocably that wealth without family was hollow, that power created responsibility rather than privilege, that the only legacy worth building was measured in relationships and positive impact rather than quarterly earnings. Her greatest accomplishment wasn't the companies she'd grown or the fortune she'd accumulated. It was finding Jasmine, building a relationship despite impossible circumstances, and transforming their shared trauma into a foundation that would protect others. Everything else had been preparation for this, for understanding that family was everything, that connection mattered more than control, and that the truest measure of a life well lived was love given and received rather than power wielded or wealth accumulated.